All right, hello, Berg here. So somebody suggested in my last video that I do a list on imperial Chinese dynasties. I know, okay, it's a little bit dry, a little bit boring, but I love Chinese history. I've studied it, I've taught it. I'm by no means an expert, but I do have a working knowledge of it. So I thought, okay, cool, that's a good place to start. So criteria for this list, running from superb down through a D. Probably most importantly, I'm going to say is influential ideas and technology that gets passed on, whether that's internally to China or outside of China. I think also pretty important is sort of peace and stability of the empire, the dynasty. And so I guess what that comes down to really is quality of life. Like, what was it like for the average person? Like, it's great, about the important people in history, quote unquote. But at the end of the day, you've got millions of people living there. What is life like for them? And then I'd say a third and probably less important criteria is longevity of the dynasty. And to some degree, that goes hand in hand with the peace and stability, right? Not always necessarily, but if it's peaceful, if it's stable, probably going to last longer. All right, so let's get this started. So, and by the way, pronunciations, I'm going to butcher them. I apologize in advance. The Xia Empire, where do we put these guys? Unfortunately, they go in D. Here's the reason. There's not really any archaeological evidence backing up this dynasty. It's on some lists. It's kind of traditional. There's an emperor called Emperor Yu, that, is supposed to have tamed the Yellow River. And while that's a good thing, we just don't really have enough going with the Xia to really put them in a category, in my opinion. Shang are interesting. You start talking about influential ideas, and this is where we see writing. So that's going to be a big one, right? We see it on these oracle bones, and so the oracle bones are kind of a way of asking questions about the future, divination, and so we can see a lot about the society as well based on these oracle bones that have been discovered. They also learn to work in bronze. Not super well organized, doesn't control a whole lot of China. Also does human sacrifice. This is generally when a ruler dies, servants to serve them. Believed to be a lot of prisoners of war, but that kind of, the writing's big. Human sacrifice, not super, widespread. B, C. I'm going to put them in C. I don't know, the human sacrifice thing. Talking about quality of life, that's pretty low quality of life. Again, it's not like a lot of people were killed, but we got to have some C's and D's. All right, so next is Zhao dynasty. So they're interesting. They're going to come up with the mandate of heaven. And the idea is that it's kind of like divine right in Europe, but different in the sense that rather than a god figure granting a king figure the right to rule, this is more like, hey, as the rulers, you're not really doing what the order of the universe wants. You're messing with the order of the universe, so you're out. We're going to put in a new group that's going to handle things better. And so these guys are around for about as long as the Shang, about 300 years. They are influential in that regard in terms of the mandate of heaven. They improve on the bronze work, the writing, very loosely control sort of their outlying provinces, which leads to a lot of problems. There is a portion of the Zhao dynasty that goes on for longer than the 300 years, but I think there's enough issues here that we're going to put them down here with the Shang with a C. All right. So after Zhao dynasty, we get into this period of warring states, a lot of anarchy. And eventually, who pulls them out of this is the Qin. And so the Qin dynasty is interesting. It lasts a whopping 14 years. One of their big contributions is legalism. It's basically the idea that anything you do that's bad, you get punished for. Anything you do good, you're rewarded for. And we're talking pretty bad punishments here, like cutting off hands, disemboweling people, being buried alive. But it was effective, right? The military was effective. The sort of rule of law was effective in a time of anarchy. They also standardized a lot of things, standardized coinage, standardized, things as simple as the length of an axle or the width of an axle on a wagon, which sounds weird, but, at the end of the day, it runs ruts on the roads, right? And so you want those ruts to all be lined up so the wagon can go from province to province or what used to be kingdom to kingdom. But very militaristic, didn't really adapt well to the peaceful rule. The ruler, Shi Huangdi, is a little bit of an egomaniac, paranoid. And as soon as he dies, like, this thing falls apart. So I get that it gives its name to China, that it unites the country after this long period of anarchy. I just, 14 years says something, right? I know I'm getting a lot of C's here. I got to put them down here. All right, so the Qin fails, and then we have the Han Dynasty. Now, the Han Dynasty is interesting. They're around for 400 years, so they're going to be the longest-lived dynasty up until this point. Really focus on trade. The Silk Road opens up. They're doing trade with, the Eastern Mediterranean, essentially, through Central Asia. The Parthians are a big part of this, sort of a nomadic group. And silk starts to show up in a lot of places outside of China. And the Han also start at the beginning of a bureaucracy. So, the Qin, in fairness, really started sort of this idea of if you're the most able for the job, you get the job. And I'm going to talk more about the bureaucracy as we get farther into this. But, the Han Dynasty, I'm going to say, is very peaceful, very prosperous. A lot of people do well. I'm going to put it in A. All right, so after the Han, we have this period of it's Three Kingdoms starts out. There's actually a book called The Romance of Three Kingdoms. And after that, we get into, sometimes called the Six Dynasties. Basically, it's fractured again. Not as bad as the period of Warring States. But much like coming out of that, we have this Sui Dynasty. And the Sui Dynasty is going to be like the Qin. They're not long-lived. I mean, rather than 14 years, I think they get 40 years. They build the Grand Canal, which is important because a lot of the... the runoff from the mountains in China is going to run east-west, okay? And so, this time you want to transport things by water. You can just transport a lot more by water based on the technology available. So the Grand Canal runs north-south. So now you have a means of enabling trade to the north and south. Again, standardizing a lot of things that have fallen, that each kingdom's kind of made into its own sort of standards of measure and what have you. They also start something called the equal field system. Great idea. Basically, the number of able-bodied people that work for you on your land, that's how much land you get. So it enables all land to be taxable. It enables land not to just be sitting idle and collecting in the hands of a very few, right? So it kind of makes the aristocracy not quite as strong. They also are pretty heavy-handed. They also try and invade Korea, not once, but 3 times. And people say enough's enough. And so for that reason, I just got to say quality of life, the number of people that died building the Grand Canal, these wars, I got a lot of people in C, don't I? And we're going to throw them down in C. All right, the Tang Dynasty. Okay, now these guys, so they, take over from the Sui. They're very interested in the arts, among other things. They reestablish trade. You see this sort of tongue of land sticking out there. They reestablish sort of the Silk Road and these defensive forts that the Han had set up along the Silk Road. Trade oriented. Very much into the arts. Some of the greatest poetry comes out of this period. There's all kinds of inventions. I mean, gunpowder is showing up at this time. The Tang Dynasty is, some consider the golden age of China, right? It's really the pinnacle. I mean, also Buddhism flourishes at this time. And the scholars, this sort of idea of this meritocracy, right? You can take an exam, and if you do well in the exam, you get into the bureaucratic service. And this is kind of seen as the pinnacle, right? Like, if you're a part of this scholarly bureaucratic service, there's almost no end to the heights you can achieve. Now, I don't mean to say this is a pure meritocracy. If you're a poor dirt farmer lying in an outlying district, your ability to, take the exam and do well versus a nobleman who has someone tutoring him all the time. Okay. I get it. And there's probably also, glass ceilings within the service, right? Again, if you're this poor person from an outlying district, are you really going to be, the Lord Chamberlain of China? Okay. But the point is that there is a meritocracy in place. You can have some social mobility, and we see this throughout Chinese history, but I think especially in the Tang. I got to give these guys a S. We're going to put them up in the superb category. All right, along comes the Song Dynasty, and this is going to be interesting. Population blows up, right? There's a lot of agricultural techniques. For example, the dragon backbone. not that dragon backbone. Provides for additional irrigation. There's terracing, iron production. We don't see iron production again like we do in the Sung Dynasty until like 1800s Europe. Okay. And, also into the art, it's very sophisticated. Their big kind of drawback is, a lot of internal squabbling, right? Politically, they're not very well united. Quality of life is going to be good for part of the time. The Sung's interesting. Is it 300 years? Is it 150? Depends on what you count. Because the northern part of the Sung gets conquered by a nomadic group called the Jurchen. And so part of this happens just simply because of these internal struggles, right? And so while it is probably a very good time to live in China, I'm going to put them down here in the A just again because of those internal struggles sort of leading to their fall. All right, next we got the Yuan. Interesting. So this is essentially the Mongols. The Mongols! They don't rule long, about 90 years. Part of that is because, they never really learn Chinese, like the language. They adapt some things from the culture, but they also kind of keep themselves in a strata separate from the rest. They never really integrate into Chinese society. They try to invade Japan several times, Kublai Khan, and just not really about the quality of life of the average Chinese citizen. So they're going to add to this growing group of C dynasties. All right, so the Ming come along. Ming are interesting. They start out sort of expansive, looking outward. Zheng He does his famous voyages around the Indian Ocean basin. The Great Wall as we know it today is built at this time. It had existed, but in a much more like packed earth versus the stone that we think of it today. They built the palace complex in Beijing. Generally a time of trade and prosperity, but they kind of cut all this off. They start to look internally. They seal their borders, and I think that's part of the decline of China happens with the Ming, and they also have this internal squabbling. So while there's a lot of good things about the Ming, there's also some stuff that I think kind of laid the groundwork for the Chinese dynasties failing. So we're going to put them in B. Qing. Now this is a tough one. So these are Manchus. They're kind of the descendants of the Jurchen that I talked about with the Sung. They come in from the north. They conquer China. They're very organized militarily. Once they come in power, they kind of do this balancing act between maintaining sort of Manchu identity, but also like catering to the Chinese, but I think it puts them in this weird position where they're never really fully Chinese, and the Han Chinese, never fully accept them. And so while there is a lot of peace and prosperity, there's also this a lack of understanding about foreign policy and nations in the world. And what I mean by that is they're very dismissive of people like the English until the English get tired of it one day. And basically, the Opium Wars, they invade the country, they open up ports. And so in the Qing is, talking about the bureaucratic system, this kind of, changes a little bit into them. They're more trying to manipulate it to fit their needs versus, this sort of meritocracy idea. And so they really are, they deserve their own fate, I guess, in a way. They last about 300 years. God, I hate to fill up the C one so much, but I feel like average is average, especially compared to some of these, the Tang and the Han dynasties. So I'm going to put Qing down here and C. So that's it. I know it was a little long-winded. I talked a lot. I tried to put in a few things there to make it a little more interesting, but so I have it laid out there. And if you agree, great. If you disagree, go ahead and put it in the comments. If you have any other questions, put them in the comments. And somebody else had mentioned doing a World of Tanks video. I don't really play that much anymore, but I was thinking maybe I'd do like video games over the course of my lifetime that I've really enjoyed. But anyway, if you have any other ideas, go ahead and throw them down in the comment section. All right, thanks. You guys take care, and I'll see you again soon.